Hello and welcome to AXSchat. I'm joining you today from the British Computer Society in London, and we're delighted to have David Bray with us. David is the CIO, Chief Information Officer of the FCC, that's the Federal Communications Commission in the United States. David is a change maker and really very social CIO, so and also very active on the topics around access and inclusion. So we're delighted to have you with us today, David. Thank you so much for taking the time. Can you tell us a bit more about your work and your efforts to assure the social impact and support change makers?
Sure. So first, thanks for having me here, Neil, and I really appreciate the conversation that we're going to have. And accessibility is one of the things that is most important, in my opinion, for everybody to have when it comes to communication. I mean, communication should be something that's accessible to everyone. And so we're living in an era of exponential change. It's not just rapid change, but exponential change. The amount of network devices on the face of the planet has doubled in less than 2 years, going from 7 billion in the year 2013 to upwards of 14 billion just 2 years later in 2015, and will continue to double. Same thing is happening with data. There is now more than 10 zettabytes, that is equivalent to 10 billion terabytes. And here in the United States, the Library of Congress, our Library of Congress is 10 terabytes. I'm sure if you're a Bodleian Library and other things in the UK, you may have larger library contents. But when I'm talking about 10 zettabytes of data on the face of the planet, I'm really talking about 1 billion versions of the Library of Congress. And that's also doubling every 2 years. And so not only do you have more network devices and more data, but this is now creating questions about how do you make things accessible to people on the internet. When websites were static, we here in the States, we had this thing called 508 compliance. And basically what 508 compliance means is it needs to be readable to screen readers, needs to have high contrast for people that need to have high contrast, needs to be able to do translation of text to voice. The challenge now is the web increasingly is dynamic, and so it's not static. And so the question is, how do you make things that have menus that come and go? How do you make things that have pop-ups accessible to people that need things, whether it's for vision or whether they need to have things spoken to them or they need to be able to interact with it. So it's not just being able to receive, but if someone needs to have some way of actually interacting through sign language, again, technology is changing so rapidly, and unfortunately, oftentimes it's a minimal viable product. And so part of a minimal viable product, it doesn't think about how do you make it accessible to everybody. To me, that is one of the biggest mandates of what we need to do with communications. Now, there's two challenges in particular we have to face. The first is that technology is global. And so even if we come up with guidance and recommendations here in the United States, how do we actually socialize that across the entire world so that products that maybe are built halfway a world away take into account the needs that we have here, what we call 508 compliance, that our website actually incorporates it. We need to actually recognize the global nature of technology. And then the other challenge is, I really think the future is going to be making things accessible both to humans, and this is maybe the value proposition to innovators, also making things accessible to machines. If you think about it, what's needed for machine learning and for artificial intelligence is to be able to make sense of images, to be able to make sense of text, which is the same thing you want a human to be able to do too if they have different needs or especially different access things they need to do. So I think the value proposition we can make to entrepreneurs is, let's make sure you make it accessible both for humans and at the same time for machines, and in some respects, you're making your technology future-proof for the world we're going to.
Those are great points.
Yeah, I agree.
Deborah, I'll pass over to you.
Well, no, and I agree. Those are really great points. And one thing that we've seen, all of us are also technologists, which is why we appreciate that you're a change agent and you're really looking at these topics from social impact, not only in the United States, but globally. Because communications, I believe, it's going to change everything. And we often say that something like Google is the largest deaf-blind user in the world. And so building it so that machines and technology can access the information will make the information accessible to all of us, including people like, with different disabilities and stuff. So, on that note, of course, we know communications is a critical access to bridging really helping with the digital divide and access for all. But at the same time, it's very exciting to see. I know that right now Neil is at a Smart Cities conference in London. And so the opportunities for the IoTs, the smart cities, the robotics, all those things, not only to improve the lives of people with disabilities, but improve the lives of all people, I think is very exciting. So, tell us about, what you think we're going to be able to do globally to really tap into the communications that are changing so fast.
So you're absolutely right that they're changing fast. And when I arrived here at the FCC 3 years ago, it was an interesting state in which they'd had 9 CIOs in 8 years, which is always a good sign for CIO number 10. I'm sure things are going well. And they had more than 207 different IT systems for an agency that was less than 2,000 people. And so I sometimes joke that I felt a little bit like Oprah Winfrey. Everybody look underneath your chair. Congratulations, you're getting an IT system going home with it. And so those systems, more than half of them were more than 10 years old. And unfortunately, legacy technology not only is brittle because it's old, but oftentimes did not take into account the different needs for people to access it that have changed with the world. And so what we've been in the process of doing is moving those systems to modern cloud platforms. And when we pick modern cloud platforms, working with the vendor to try and make sure whatever we pick is, again, we have this thing in the United States we call 508 compliant, making sure it is accessible to people with different needs. And so in some respects, we're using the buying power of public service to actually encourage vendors to move their products along. There was one case when we updated our consumer help desk. We went with a vendor, I won't name their names, but initially they hadn't thought about 508 compliance. And we said, well, that's going to be a bit of a challenge because we're a public-facing agency. We've got to think about how we bake that in. And so actually on their own, they actually identified another company called AudioEyes. And AudioEyes actually helps with making sites accessible to everyone. And on their own, they actually worked together. And so before we actually went live, this product that we were thinking about using on their own actually reached out and found a private sector answer to make their product 508 compliant. And that helped both us so that when we rolled out the new consumer help desk, it was actually accessible to everyone. However, they also baked it into their features. And so as a result, it was accessible to everybody as a result going forward. And so I think in some respects, public service can be forward-leaning and help encourage the private sector to bake in these things into their products and as a result, make it accessible to everyone. The other example I would give is when we arrived here, as again, we're trying to move things to the cloud, we had a website that had been redone in 2010, unfortunately without involving a lot of stakeholders, both externally as well as internally. And the reaction to this website when it was rolled out, people were not too favorable to it because, one, it changed things around. People had been used to using it a certain way, but it also had not fully taken into account 508 compliance. And so it had left that, it had been sitting that way until I arrived. And I knew when I parachuted in, it wasn't just a simple fix of redesign the website. That would actually maybe even fan the flames more and antagonize people. We were very intentional about doing a year-long, agile, rapid sprint effort where we rolled out a prototype. We allowed people to give feedback, both from the 508 accessibility community, but also from all the different stakeholders of FCC externally. And as a result, when it finally went live through those rapid sprints, finally a year later, it actually had more than 85% of the visitors saying they loved it better than anything that had actually previously done by FCC. And so I think public service can involve different communities in early prototyping and make sure they're baking in their requirements so that when things go live, everyone has access and we move forward together.
So I need to ask you here in that case, the fact that you were able to achieve such a work, how do you see that impacting in other agencies and how they can work in the space of being more inclusive with citizens?
So that's a great question. And the interesting thing with that, Antonio, is when I proposed in 2013 that in less than 2 years we were going to go to 100% public cloud or commercial service provider, people looked at me like I was crazy. They said, well, why would you not want to do your IT on premise? And I was like, why would you want to do your IT on premise? I mean, the expertise of public service is not necessarily doing IT. The expertise is meeting the mission needs. And you notice I'm using the word public service. So let me define that a little bit. That I think the word, and I'm going to be a little bit provocative here, but intentionally so, I think the word government is an increasingly outdated 20th century term. And what we really need to talk about is public service that includes everybody, in the sense that the public can receive services, but they can also be involved with coming up with solutions that they can innovate on their own. public service also includes private sector partners that are thinking beyond just their own bottom line. It's almost what some people call the triple bottom line, in which, yes, you're making a profit, but you're also thinking about the ethics and the contributions to society you're doing as well. And then finally, yes, there is a place for government professionals, but it's working in that context of actually all three together. And so when I initially said I wanted to go to involving the private sector to do our commercial cloud, to do our public offerings, people thought I was crazy. But I said the only way we can keep up with this technology change is to involve the private sector. And so now, actually more than a year ago, so it was actually September 2015, when we finally made the final leap to having everything either in a public cloud or a commercial service provider. As a result, instead of spending 85% of our budget just to maintain systems, it actually got reduced to less than 50%. And this was on a full budget. In the past, it took about 6 or 7 months to stand up a new system and prototype it. We can now get you a working prototype in less than 48 hours. And we did that with what we call change agents, which I say anyone who's willing to step outside of status quo. And that has now shown other agencies here in the States, but also abroad, that you can go to a public cloud model. And I think as a result, now you're seeing many more people sort of jumping on, because I moved forward, I didn't get killed, and so now they're willing to do it too. But it took that one person who was willing to step forward first and not get killed and move forward together.
Okay, so these change agents are obviously very important, and they're enabling the organization to be digital and fleet of foot and agile, if in the non-software methodology point of view. But how are you engaging change agents to be more accessible as well as more public focused?
So we actually hired about a year ago, and it actually had been longer in the process, but again, FCC's had a flat budget for about 6 or 7 years, and we've actually gone down from having 2,250 people to 1,750 people. So we lost about 500 people over the last 10 years. But I did make the case to get a specific billet assigned for someone who is R508 compliant for the entire commission. Now, that's not recognizing that, that's recognizing that you need that person, but not one person can say their responsibility is 508 compliance and no one else has a responsibility. So all of our change agents, whenever they're coming forward for a proposal, actually needs to work with the 508 compliance to make sure that their proposal, what they're teeing up, has baked in accessibility requirements. And we interact with both the accessibility community here at the FCC. We also interact with the accessibility community outside of the FCC as well. So we interact with other departments. Our Health and Human Services here in the United States is really big and sort of helping to bring together other agencies to this cause, and we provide them input. They provide us input as well. And the other thing that we've been doing is when we meet with vendors. When we meet with vendors, I tell them, don't make the pitch to me, because actually I'm not going to buy as to whether or not we're going to do it or not. I'm only going to buy it if you've gone to one of my change agents and generated a pitch, and then they jointly propose it to me. And so as a result, there's companies like IBM, like Microsoft and others who actually have come to us and they've actually said, well, we're hearing from your change agents, you won't buy on this unless it actually has 508 baked in. I'm like, that's correct. And so as a result, they've actually circled back and begun to involve our change agents here in the public service space to actually work with their private sector to bake it into their products. And so it's almost like a peer pressure function, which is if you want to do business with us, you need to think about how you bake this in. And as a result, it rises all tides. The final thing that I would say about change agents is I treat it like an internal venture capitalist, in the sense that when you come to me, give me 3 reasons why we should do an effort, but also give me 3 reasons why not. And sometimes I might say, this product right now is not accessible to everybody. And I'm like, well, we can't really buy it off until we can. So then I also ask them to give me 3 reasons how we're going to address that concern. And so part of it is, we can't do this right now, but we'll work over the next 6 to 9 months with that vendor. And after that vendor is ready, then we can move forward together. And so in some respects, I'm encouraging public service change agents to be creative problem solvers, recognizing innovation comes from both government professionals and from the private sector. Ultimately, we want the private sector to buy into this, and so it's almost like rising all boats together.
Thank you, and I think it's really important, and I'm 100% with you on the procurement power aspect of raising the bar with accessibility. I think it's a really powerful message when you tell a vendor, actually, we didn't select your product and we went with another product because they cared about accessibility. And that we've done that a couple of times quite recently, and it's amazing the impact that actually has, because when you call their bluff, they're really surprised. What, yes. You actually went through and didn't buy it because of accessibility? Yes.
Yeah, and I think it helps. I mean, I will give, recognizing I serve right now, the United States, of course, we have both Republicans and Democrats. The FCC is both. We actually have 5 commissioners, 3 of which from one party and 2 from another. But I will say amongst all commissioners right now, they all care about accessibility. So it helps that we've also gotten our top leadership to recognize it's important. And as a result, this actually helps magnify the influence that we have when we talk to the private sector about what do we need.
And that's very encouraging, David. That's very encouraging. And I know that Antonio, Neil, and I have been watching you on Twitter. We, not stalking you or trolling you, but watching you, and just been very impressed with your leadership and the conversations you're having about change agents, not only within the FCC, but as you said, you know, taking it out to the other agencies in the United States and involving the private sector. And I know that we in the United States are in the right at the end of refreshing our Section 508 so that the law harmonizes with what the rest of the world are doing. And sometimes, David, as a U.S. citizen, talking about accessibility, I will have people say, well, I don't understand what you are doing in the U.S. Why do you put laws on the place and then you all sue each other? And it's like, well, our federal government decided that they were going to take the lead on making sure things were accessible. They have the procurement power, as you noted and as Neil noted, to make sure that you influence corporations, the private sector all over the world, to make sure that things are accessible to all citizens. I didn't warn you of this particular question, David, but do you think that the refresh of the Section 508, do you think that'll be good for the U.S. government, for the citizens of the U.S. and also globally?
So that's a great question, and I would say a refresh is definitely needed, because the reality is 508 in the past was written for static websites, and now increasingly we have websites that are dynamic, we have apps, and 508 right now doesn't really apply to apps. And so recognizing that technology has changed and it needs to be more dynamic. The other challenge that we have is there's both the need to work with the private sector, but there's also the need, here in the United States, of course, we don't have a parliamentary system. We have a division between our executive branch and the legislative branch. And the legislative branch sets our budgets. It's not actually set by the executive branch. Right now, actually, here at the FCC, we're underneath what's called a continuing resolution, which means I cannot use money for any new starts. And that can create challenges when your budget is set outside of you, because there may be a system that you need to modernize and make it to address the new 508 compliance. But if you're not necessarily getting approval to use funds for it, it can make it challenging, and that's where I have to go to the Hill and have conversations as well as the rest of the FCC. I think refreshing the new 508 combined with an awareness campaign that this is something that's extremely important, and you have to engage both the private sector but also encourage Congress, at least here in the United States, and the other legislative branches around the world, that this is something that it's not just about passing a law. You actually have to incentivize and give priority to modernization efforts that are actually focused on it. Maybe it's easier to get funds for it, recognizing, again, money is tight, we do live in limited resources, but creating awareness. The good news is, for the example of AudioEyes, when we worked with AudioEyes and that third-party vendor, by them actually working with the FCC, they did it on their own dime. They actually baked into our product without us having to even do anything. But I still had to modernize that consumer help desk. That consumer help desk was more than 15 years old. And in some cases, we had systems here in the past, fortunately we've retired them all, that were running on what was called Sun E25K servers. These were servers that were more than 18 years old, each weighing 1 ton each. Now we've retired them, but we had to do that on a flat budget. And it was a little bit challenging, but that's part of the fun of public service, is being a creative problem solver. So I think it's going to need to be both the updated 508 compliance being harmonized with the rest of the world, also just an awareness that we need to then update the systems to meet it. And it's not just a compliance exercise, because if you just do a compliance exercise, then it gets challenging. It's really about involving the stakeholders, having them actually help address and raise to the legislature the importance of it. Because the reality is, if the outside community says this is important, the legislative branch will listen to it even more than if I say something. And so it really has to be in that public service sort of triangle, all working together for the virtue of us all and rising all those boats together.
And you know, David, you've mentioned AudioEyes, and we know about AudioEyes, and we actually, both Neil and myself, I wrote a blog about could using a middleware or an overlay system like an AudioEyes, a user first, some of those, could it be part of your strategic plan? And then Neil wrote a great article saying, well, is it snake oil? Is it snake oil? Because some people were saying that. But I think one problem that we've had with accessibility is, and we're all technologists here, but one of the problems has been we've said you need to solve these major technology problems in a manual way. Just as fast as technology and communications is moving, it's just, it's really unheard of. And so I think it's very interesting that the FCC, through your vendors, are being a best practice with showing how accessibility can be baked in, love that term, baked in, and that there is a place for the middleware and the overlays. And Neil, I don't know if you want to make a comment before I pass it to David and then over to Antonio, but
Sure.
We find it very interesting what's happening with that. We think it's showing great promise.
So I'm a big fan of adopting new technology, and if middleware or overlays or interoperability applications can deliver to the end user the accessibility that's not available elsewhere, why not use it? I'm technology agnostic. What I'm interested in is results for people. Antonio,
go ahead, Neil.
Yeah. So I know Antonio wants to come in, and Deborah and I have hogged the conversation a bit. Antonio always has some insights, so.
Well, but let's let David answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's a great question. Is that, there's obviously a challenge in that if you're using middleware, you're not fundamentally changing what you would change the underlying product. The one thing I would say is, I'm increasingly of the belief that for those of us in public service, specifically on the government side, we should not be coding. If we code something, then we're now responsible for maintaining it. And while we might be able to customize it to what we want, 5 years later, the people that initially coded may have left, they may have forgotten how to do it, it becomes expensive and burdensome to maintain. And so we should not be in the business of coding in public service. We should be remixing and reusing things that are available from the private sector. And if the private sector right now doesn't have things fully baked in with 508 compliance, middleware can be sort of a solution to get there. I do think ultimately it'd be great to have it baked into the products natively, and so maybe that's where peer pressure will fit in. The other thing that I'm also interested in is, again, I really think there's a big positive message to be pushed that says, vendors, you want your product to be accessible both to humans and to machines, right, and to be able to be made sense of. And so whether that's done through middleware or that's done natively in the product, in a perfect world, we might even pressure the search engines that in their index of the searching, it actually makes it available too. But I think that's ultimately, there are multiple paths to virtueness. We just need to figure out how we can encourage and motivate the industry as a whole to get there.
Well said. Antonio?
No, looking to the world, over the past 2 years, we have interviewed people from many different areas, from different governments around the world. What I would like to know is, when you are developing this work, do people call you about, oh no, you guys are doing this? No, can you, why? No, or do you have this type of interactions? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. That's partly why I came on social media. Is when I arrived, there was no social media account for the FCC CIO. And when I initially asked to create one, they're like, why do you want one? I was like, well, because our middle name is communications. And then they said, well, you can do one in a personal account. I was like, I don't think people care about me personally. It really is about the role. So I created it to have those conversations. And sure enough, I would get people that would give me comments, both good and bad, about what was working and what was not working at the FCC. I actually intentionally did it because I knew we were going to have such a hard modernization challenge. I knew that, again, 9 CIOs in 8 years, didn't really want to be the 10th CIO out the door in less than 6 months. And so one of the things I first did when I arrived at there was I actually found a 56K modem that was still in the box unopened, that dated back to the 1990s. And so I actually took a photo of it and I uploaded it to my Twitter account and said, found at the FCC, hopefully our modernization efforts will be better than this. Really meant to have the conversations. And then actually just this weekend, I noticed that there's a group that's having a CIO conversation, and they're asking the question by uploading a photo. However, they're not doing alt tags on the photo. And that's actually where Neil was very helpful, actually, and Antonio, because they both came back and said, well, you can actually tag the photo with an alt tag using a new feature in Twitter. And so as a result, they collectively educated the group as a whole. And so if you're not engaged and if you're not having conversations, you're not learning. And for me, I engage and have those conversations because I know I'm going to have blind spots. I know there are going to be things I'm going to miss. I want to learn. I also know I've got finite resources, so I can't do everything. But if I can engage you in a conversation and say, here's why we're doing this right now, and we hope to get to 2, 3, and 4 later once we have the funds, it's a much more positive conversation than being silent.
We appreciate the engagement, David. We so appreciate it. We're not seeing that engagement from most CIOs, certainly not government CIOs. Neil,
Okay.
I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you. We definitely do appreciate the engagement. We set up AXSchat because we wanted to engage and because we want to facilitate that global conversation. Thank you for being part of it. We've reached the end of our half hour. It's been brilliant talking to you, and I'm sure that we're going to have a very interesting conversation on Twitter tomorrow. So thank you once again, David. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you,
David.
Thanks.